So good morning, everybody, and welcome. So this is today's edition of the International Macroeconomic History Online Seminar Series. This is organized by Geneva's Graduate Institute's Center for Finance and Development, along with the Center for Economic Policy Research, as well as a bunch of other universities. My name is Mark Dincheco. I'm coming at you from the University of Michigan in the United States, and I'll be chairing today's seminar. Today, we're very excited to have Julia Caget and Edgar de Witt presenting the paper, It Takes Money to Make MPs, New Evidence from 150 Years of British Campaign Spending. Before I hand it over to the authors, let me quickly go over the ground rules. So the webinar is going to run an hour. The first 40 minutes are going to be for the presenters. The remaining 20 minutes are going to be for questions. And if we go over, we'll add in 15 minutes of additional informal conversation. Questions can only be asked in the Q&A space. Please do not use the chat. Please put your questions in the Q&A space. At the end of the presentation, I'll ask the questions that you've submitted in order to keep things running efficiently. If there are clarification questions during the seminar, please send me those again in the Q&A, and I will interrupt the speakers if need be and ask those questions. Okay, I think that's pretty much it. So why don't I hand it over to Edgar, who's going to do today's presentation.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Let me share my screen. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everyone, for attending. I'm sorry if you were expecting Julia to present. I'm going to present today, but I'll try to do my best to be as good as her. So this is joint work with her. She's in the audience, so don't hesitate to ask questions in the chat. She can answer as well. And it's a work that we started a few years ago. So we worked quite a lot already on it, but I mean, as you're going to see, it's a very ambitious project. And so any feedback is obviously super welcome. Okay, so it's called It Takes Money to Make MPs, New Evidence from 150 Years of British Campaign Spending. And the motivation for this paper is, the fact that even though there's a very large literature in campaigning in general, and especially in campaign spending, it's usually focused on very short periods of time and mostly recent periods of time, usually constrained by the data, right? And at the same time, campaigning has existed since elections were held, which in our case, the UK is a long time ago. And we all know that campaign technologies and campaigning techniques have evolved a lot over that period, right? And today we're going to go to a time where actually candidates were paying voters to go to the poll, which is quite different from what we have today with micro-targeting on social media or those types of techniques, right? So the question here is really, how did the campaign spending patterns, so meaning on what types of things candidates at election are spending their money, changed over time, and how the relationship with this spending and votes, which is a question that's been asked a lot, has also evolved over time, over the very long run, right? The very long run meaning we're starting in 1857, right? So in 1854, there was a law passed in the UK which asked for the candidates to register their expenses, their electoral expenses. And so we collected data on these expenses. They run over the whole period, with the only exception of 1918, where there's no data. So it means it's 41 elections and about 20K election constituencies. So constituencies times election. And this data on campaign spending does not only contain the total spending of candidates, but also the categories of spending. So we know on what types of things the candidates spend their money. And that's not a small thing. We actually linked those data to a lot of socioeconomic characteristics of candidates in constituencies that I'm going to talk to you into more detail later. So that's for the first thing that we do in this paper. And then we use this data to first have just a descriptive look at campaigns over the very long run and kind of relate that to all the historical qualitative accounts that we have in other literatures. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to look at how the relationship between those spending and electoral outcomes, and in particular vote, changed over time, right? What we do is we use an empirical strategy that we built based on the conditional logit model, right? Because this is multi-party data, so it kind of has its own challenges, empirical challenges. And we're going to introduce a lot of fixed effects, especially on candidates fixed effects, right? Because we're able to track candidates over time. And hopefully this is going to alleviate a bit of the endogeneity concerns that we have usually in this literature. But what I want to stress here is really that what's interest for us is the correlation between spending and vote. And we're not going to aim, at least in this paper, to have a kind of definitive answer on the causal impact of spending on vote. And so we look at this relationship over time, and then we're going to link this change in the relationship that we see with two things in particular: change in information technologies and change in electoral competition. Okay, so that's the plan for today. Just a quick teaser on the results. What we're going to find is that, unsurprisingly, there's the strong positive correlation between spending and votes. Most interestingly, it's actually driven a lot by one category that's called printing advertising, and we're going to discuss that in much more detail. But very interestingly, this magnitude is actually changing a lot over time. And we're going to link that again to change in electoral competition and to, as I mentioned, information technologies. And what we're going to see is that actually, at least in our case, every time there is an introduction of a new technology that candidates can directly or indirectly use for campaigns, then what we call the efficiency of spending, but just the sensitivity of votes to campaign spending is increasing. Okay, I mean, we can talk a lot about the related literature because it's enormous, right? It's roughly speaking the literature on campaigning, more specifically on campaign spending, right? Has been developed a lot in the US, but actually quite recently is well developed in other countries, and the literature on campaigning more specifically with its relations to campaign technologies, right? And for instance, paper of Larcinese and Miller who look at the impact of the introduction of the internet, of our TV ads from Spenkuti and Antoniati, for instance. The idea here is really that the way we fit into this very large literature is really, again, to look at this very long run approach and to incorporate these different elements, the different technologies and electoral environments into one study. And we also relate to the literature on electoral competition and especially its relation with campaign finance. This is both a theoretical and an empirical literature, and the idea here is that we're going to bring these questions to the specific relationship between spending and votes. Okay. Quick overview of what we're going to do. I'm going to briefly go through the data set. Then I'm going to, as I announced, have a more descriptive look at the data, and then go into this question of what's the relationship between campaign spending and votes, both over time, over space, and then try to explain why there's been some changes. Okay, so as I mentioned, since 1854, there's a rule requiring candidates to record their expense, right, in the UK. And so these electoral expenses are published in the parliamentary papers that we encoded and merged together to get this full list of electoral expenses over the all years. And this is an example of the data. As I mentioned, you're going to see that there is the total spending of the candidates, but also there is a detail for all the different types of spending by these candidates, right? And at the same time, there's also information about the spending limit that I'm going to mention and talk much more in detail later, and on the votes polled by the candidates, which is going to be obviously very helpful. Just a quick note on these expenses. In the UK, what we call electoral expenses are going to be all the expenses incurred by a candidate over the course of a candidacy, meaning starting at the dissolution of parliament to the next general election, which is usually a period of 1 to 2 months, right? Importantly, there's specific, it could take a lot of different forms, but there's very specific things that are forbidden. For instance, broadcast media advertising, right? So you're not going to see, as in the US, for instance, advertising on TV, and also what they call third parties expenditure, which is basically other people spending money, people that are not related to your campaign, but actually promoting your campaign. This is also very heavily controlled as compared to other countries. So it's quite limited in our setting. And as I mentioned, there is an important rule that has been set in 1885, and that actually remain in place since then, is that there's spending limits on how much you can spend as an individual. And those limits are related to the number of registered voters that there is in the constituency. Alexander Fuirne has a paper on that. He basically collected part of our data simultaneously, and he looks interestingly how these limits impact the amount of money that's spent and the electoral competition in those in the constituency related to that. Okay, so as I mentioned, we take the spending data, and because we have the full name of the candidates in the spending data, we link it to. I mean, first we can group the same candidates together, right, using automated, both manual and automated techniques, and so we can get the incumbency status of the candidate. We can also get from the full names, gender and titles of the candidates. And we have done extra collection first to get the political party, which before 1969 is not on the ballot, so not in our data. And more importantly, we are in a process of collecting the background of all the candidates at general elections since the beginning of a period, which is part of a companion paper. So I'm not going to talk too much about that, but the idea is that we're going to use that both in terms of controls and to look a bit into the heterogeneity of spending. And this is data on the age and origins, but also education, occupation of all candidates. And the third building block of this data set that we're going to use today is information about the constituencies themselves, which are in a sense quite challenging to get for a later period, right? Recently, the data is produced, census data is produced at the constituency level, but for previous years, there is a whole work of mapping constituencies with census administrative boundaries. And so we worked on that to get socioeconomic information at the constituency level for our period. Obviously, we're not going to have all the different variables that we have today up until the 19th century, but we can already know population and occupation figures from this period. And of course, as we're going to discuss in the regression, we're going to control for a lot of other electoral dimensions of the constituency that we can compute through the voting data. Okay, so this is the data. The first thing I want to do today is just to have a look on it. First, for us to kind of understand what is campaigning in the 19th and early 20th century, which is, at least it wasn't for me, a very intuitive thing. And then to see how we can actually better understand that through the use of campaign spending data. First, a big snapshot. This is the total spending by candidates over time in normalized constant 2016 euros. What you see, the first pattern that you see that's obvious is, so the blue line is the euros, is that it's heavily decreasing over time. This is for many reasons, and one is, as I mentioned, the fact that spending limits are changing and getting stricter and stricter over time. And what you see in red is that this is also true in terms of nominal earnings of individuals at the time, right? And to give you, so kind of you get the sense of the decrease. At the time, the levels were so high as for one candidate in a constituency could spend about 30 times what a median individual, the average individual in the UK would gain in a year. So at the time, and that's a feature that actually that's in the qualitative literature, the total spending of candidates were extremely high, and that's partly one of the reasons why they put spending limits. This is the same thing, but with a table and so much more information. what you see is that, so I've divided this whole time span into several periods that we're going to discuss in more details. But you see again that in terms of spending decreased, spending per candidate, per constituency, and per candidate and per voter. That being said, the spending per candidate and per voter decreased much more. This is also because something else changed over the period, which is the fact that more and more people could get the right to vote, right? There's an extension of the franchise, and we go from people who can, about 4 or 5% of people who can vote in 1850, 4 or 5% of the UK population, to about 80% today. So what I mean, we can spend a lot of time on this table. What I want to just go through with you is a bit more into details into these different periods to kind of understand what are the data is showing us. So in the what I call the pre-modern era, which is before 1885, and a reform that kind of first put the spending limits and the better control on the expenses, you could find actually anything into the campaign spending reports. That's an example of it. We are currently in the process of trying to classify this, but you would have a lot of different elements that are actually sometimes borderline legal. And this is, I mean, this is also explaining why the levels are extremely high at the period, because there's very little control, right? And comes in the 1885 reform, where first you're going to have more rationalization of expenses and an increase in the electorate, meaning that candidates have to change the way they campaign, right? What they're going to have to do is to doing more and more meetings, but at the time meetings, sorry, let me first show you that. So the fact that 1885 is rationalizing the expenses and actually creating the categories that we have, right? So this means that I can show you this graph, which is so over time, the share of spending devoted to each categories of spending, right? Let's have a quick look on them. So there is the printing and advertising, the organization of electoral meetings, the relocation of committee rooms, agents, which are we're probably gonna discuss them extensively because they're important elements of the campaigns. They are basically the chief organizer of the campaign, and every candidate needs to have one, and the clerks and messengers that are working for the campaign. So what you see here is that, again, the broad pattern is that spending is mostly on printing and advertising, and this share is dramatically increasing over time. But what I mentioned earlier is that even though meetings are kind of appearing into the late 19th century, the share of spending, and we can zoom in actually, the share of spending that's devoted to them is quite low, because at the time, it's basically people standing on a chair in the middle of a village. Whereas actually, over the following periods where meetings kind of need more material, you see, for instance, a doubling of the share of spending that's devoted to them. And then when the meetings actually disappear from the political scene, at least for local campaignings, you see the drop in here. What you see also in this graph is the change in the types of staff that people use, that candidates use, meaning at the beginning of the period, a very large share of the spending is devoted to actually paid staff, the agents and the messenger and the clerks, which changes over time, both because first there is a lot more volunteers coming into the campaigns, and then there's also big changes in information technologies. And that's why probably the number and the amount spent on messengers about the time where telephones kind of democratized and radio democratized is dropping a lot. But the point is that, as you can see, there's many different things that you can see in this data, and it's actually going to be very interesting. So that's why I'm not focusing too much on this period, to see how different types of spending could have different impacts on votes, and how indeed introduce technologies that are going to affect the distribution of spending could also impact the relationship between spending and votes. Okay, and how are we gonna ask this question? Well, we're gonna build a model that's taking into account the fact that when we do multi-party electoral analysis, there are constraints that makes simple OLS not working, right? And you have to bear in mind that for most of the campaign spending literature, what people would do is to actually dichotomize between challenger and incumbents and run only one regression. I mean, yeah, one regression per constituency. Sorry, have one observation per constituency in the regression, right? It means that the constraint that first the vote shares need to be constrained between 0 and 1, and most importantly, that all the vote shares in one constituency need to be equal to 1. So meaning the different observation in one constituency are correlated. Doesn't apply in that case. And in our case, we have to deal with that. So what we do is that we take a model from the higher literature where actually you can conceive things a bit the same way. How is that? Is that basically you can make the hypothesis that voters have to choose candidates based on certain set of characteristics of the candidates. And they're going to choose the candidates that give them the higher utility the higher utility, and this could be seen actually as a choice logic model, right? And so the idea is, in our case, is to say, well, so voters have to choose candidates based on a specific set of characteristics. So the probability that an individual choose a specific candidate is going to be formalized like this. That's purely logic theory. And so usually what people do is they take the log of this probability divided by a reference choice probability, so that you can have a linear expression of this choice. And the kind of the idea that we had here is to first replace these probabilities that we don't have, right? These are individual choice probabilities by the share of voters that vote for one candidate into the constituency. So we aggregate that at the constituency level, and then in order to take information from all candidates and not rely on a reference category, meaning a reference party or reference candidate that won't be present in all constituencies, we define the outside category as the outside option in the case of voting, which is to abstain. And so we normalize this without loss of information that the spending or all the characteristics on abstention, specifically on abstention, are going to be equal to 0. And so this gives an equation that we can estimate, which takes on the left-hand side the ratio between the votes for candidates and the abstention in the district, right? As we saw before. And on the right-hand side, we have the different types of characteristics of the candidates, in particular the spending of the candidates. And we can introduce both characteristics of the districts and characteristics of and several fixed effects, right? What we're going to have in all specifications are district fixed effects, right? We're going to see districts over time and control for that. We're going to have party times year fixed effects to kind of control for different trends in the party popularity or party campaign strategies, national party campaign strategies over time. And in the more restrictive specification, what we're going to control for are candidates fixed effects, right? We see candidates over time, and what we're going to be able to do with that is that within candidates, we're going to see what's the impact of a variation in their spending on the electoral results, right? So the good thing is that it captures all the unobserved heterogeneity of candidates. The disadvantage of this is that it means we can only focus on candidates running multiple times over the period, which is a small subset of the candidates, as you're going to see. So this is the results taking all years in a table format. So what you see here is that overall, there is indeed a positive relationship between spending and votes. Important thing to mention here is that the spending variable that we have is not going to be the absolute spending of the candidate, but the relative spending of the candidate depending or spending of the other candidates into the constituency, right? So it's the share of the spending of the constituency represented by a candidate, which means that in a sense, it's already taking into account that spending is an equilibrium game, and what matters is how much you spend compared to your alternative candidate. So as I said, this share of spending is positively correlated with votes. It is still positively correlated when you introduce the controls. And what we do in column 3 and 4 is that we only take candidates that run multiple times, right? So you see that there's a reduction of the sample size of about 30%. We see that this decreases a little bit the coefficient, but it remains highly significant. And on the same sample, we are introducing the candidate fixed effects. And so we see that this seems to almost half the coefficient. So what it means is that probably that indeed the unobserved heterogeneity among candidates, for instance, the quality of candidates, could explain partly the correlation, between spending and votes, but it doesn't seem to explain it fully, right? It's still that an increase in 1 percentage point in the share of a constituency total spending is increasing by 1.2 the ratio vote shares on abstention. Okay, so that's interesting, but in a sense, as I mentioned, what we really want to show in this paper
Edgar, excuse me. May I quickly interrupt you?
Yeah.
Thank you. There's a clarifying question, which is, were secret ballots present through the time period under consideration?
Okay, so it's a very good question. And again, this is why we could actually spend a lot of time in the first part. But so the answer is almost for the whole period, but secret ballot was introduced in 1872. So it means that for actually the first elections, so this is also why these elections before, in what I call the pre-modern era are a bit specific, that the first 4 elections of our sample have actually no secret ballot. And so this also obviously changed the way candidates campaign. The introduction of the secret ballot, that's something we actually would love to test, but it's hard to find the cross-section heterogeneity that you may want to test that empirically. But it's indeed interesting that over the period there is the introduction of the secret ballot, and this means that candidates now have to make campaigns without knowing who are the people who are going to vote and whether those people eventually will vote for them, right? And this is again related to the birth of electoral meetings, of canvassing, and of other forms of campaigning that are not the same thing as probably sometimes direct influence of the individuals that you want to vote for them, that you want them to vote for you. Does that answer the question? I don't know who asked it. Okay, I guess it does. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is interesting, but what we want, at least I find interesting, but what we actually are more interested in is how over time this coefficient is changing. So what do we do? Is that we run the same regression, but with an interaction between the time fixed effects and the spending coefficient. What does it do? If we plot, so basically what we do is that then we plot the beta coefficient plus the interaction term for every year, and that we see over time the evolution between the correlation between spending and votes. What do we see? The first thing is that seems that for the very first years, the relationship is very noisy and roughly seems to be null, right? This actually goes again to the discussion that we had before, and that this is a very specific period. First, there's a lot of uncontested constituencies at the time. Second, a lot of the spending is spent on various things that may or less matter, or at least marginally matter less. And this, in a sense, this changes with the introduction of better regulation and limits on campaign spending, but it's it remains quite low over the beginning of 20th century. It stagnates over, or at least it's on average about 0.8 or 9, or 8 or 9 in the mid 20th century. But what's very interesting, at least that what we are trying to investigate in the rest of the paper, is the fact that over the late 20th century, there seems to be a very large increase in the relationship between spending and votes. And this was followed by a drop in the early 2000s. Right? And what I'm trying to show you is that this could be related to both, again, electoral competition and information technologies. Okay, so this is the change over time. And if you do the same thing with regions fixed effects, you can have this at the spatial level. And what you see, so these are for every of our period, is what you see, that indeed you see that the UK becomes darker, right? Meaning indeed the correlation between spending and votes is more and more pronounced over time. And also you see that there is heterogeneity of a space, especially in the recent years, right? You can trace back the evolution from year to year up until here, where the levels are the highest, and then you see that what happens in the 2000s is actually a decrease, but most only in specific regions. So we have a variation over time, a variation over space of the impact of spending on or this correlation between spending and votes. And third thing that we can do here in terms of heterogeneity is to look at the different impact in depending on the spending categories, right? And what is quite striking here is that, so these are the same plot as you saw before, but only focusing on a specific spending category. And what it seems to appear is that the category that mostly matters is advertising and printing. We find the same pattern that we saw before, whereas it's less the case with other types of spending. Meetings and all agents and other paid staff seems to matter in the interwar period, but then, I mean, they do, but on a much less extent than advertising and printing. Right? And this has raised some question. In a sense, it's also interesting on the discussion about what are the causes of the correlation between spending and votes. It seems to have something to do with the categories. And so that's a wrap up of what I just said. And again, I don't know how I fare in terms of time, but I have to, I'll now be able to kind of dig a bit more into this change over time in the relationship between spending and vote and try to find why is that. Okay, so the first thing we're gonna look at are these information technologies, right? That's something that kind of intuitively comes to mind. First, when you have a US president that's using tweets as a campaign, but then generally when you see such a long period of time, you can realize that there's radio, TV, internet coming in, and this might matter, right? Especially given the fact that as we saw, printing and advertising seems to matter, and this ultimately talks to the visibility of candidates, right? So the question we're asking is what is the relationship between information technologies and the spending vote relationship? And we're asking it using kind of two exogenous variation in the history of UK technologies that we find. The first one is going to look at the spread of local radio, and the second one with the introduction of internet. Okay, the first one is based on the following. This choice obviously is not also only due to the fact that we can have exogenous variation, but also that these two phenomena that I'm going to look at are taking place at key periods in our period. The 70s, which is the moment actually where the correlation between spending and vote is increasing, and the 2000s when it's actually decreased. So the idea with the local radio is that even though political advertising, as I said, is not directly allowed on local radio, it's a key channel of political information. Papers have shown that, and qualitative account in the UK have shown that indeed radio is a key conveyor for political information. But the thing is that up until the 60s, there's only a few national channels in the UK. This means that I mean, this constrains local campaigns to use radio for the publicity, right? The idea being that the BBC cannot talk about all the 600 candidates of the Conservative Party in every of the constituencies. So basically they don't. And what changes in the late 60s is that you have the introduction of local radio, first local public radio, and then local private radios. And what we are going to use to identify the effect of this introduction of local radio is a freeze in the spread of local commercial radio that occurred between 1976 and 1980. This is in the spirit of previous papers, right? Like the one of Gensko 2006 or another paper by Julia that's using the freeze in the spread of TV in the US. Here, the idea is going to be the same. What happened is that in 1973, you get the opening of licensing to commercials or what they call independent radio in the UK. So you have a lot of radio coming in and spreading over the country. This, for both political and financial reasons, has to stop in 1976. And so all the licensing are stopped, are freezed, and they are taken back when the conservative government come in the late 1979, right? And so the strategy here, so let me first show you so this is the map of the spread of radio. So in gray, you have the radio that's there before 1975. In light blue, you have local radios that are opening in the year just before the freeze. And in dark blue, you have those opening afterwards, right? So the strategy here is to compare. So first, to be able to show you this map, we collected data on the coverage of local radio. Then we identify the constituencies. So these are the light blue, the 102 that got radio right before, and the 50 constituencies that got radio right after. The assumption is that conditional on the observables that we have, they are comparable in terms of the introduction of the radio. And then, so what we're gonna do is that we're gonna look at the difference between those two types of constituencies in terms of the change of the impact of spending between the election of 1974, which is right before, so at the point where all these constituencies don't have local radio, and the election in 1979, where only the first set of constituencies have access to local radio. And what you see here, so this is the interaction term, right? So the specification is the same as before, just with an additional radio term. Is what you see is that it seems, especially when you control for candidates fixed effects, radio seems to have a positive impact on the correlation between spending and votes. What it says here is that in those constituencies that got the radio right before the freeze, spending they are more efficient in 1979, or at least more correlated with votes in 1979 than for constituencies that got the radio right after. Okay, that's for local radio. We also do a similar exercise for another important technology, which is the internet, right? We all know that internet actually matters, or at least we could hypothesize that internet matters for political campaign. Actually, that's something that's been shown in a recent paper by Gavazza and co-authors. And what we do is that we're using the data on the spread of broadband internet to look at what's the impact of the internet on the correlation between spending and votes. We use the same empirical strategy as they do, which is actually to use rainfall as an instrument. And as surprising as it might be, actually rainfall, even nowadays, is impacting a lot internet access of households in the UK. And so what we're going to do here, the strategy that we're going to apply, is that we're going to take Gavazza data, which is at the world level, and aggregate it at our level, the constituency level. And then we're going to instrument the change in broadband access between the 2005 and 2010 general election through the instrument that is rainfall. And then we're going to look at the impact of spending in the constituencies that had a high positive or high change in the access to internet to those with a low change, right? So we're doing a split sample here. This is just to give you a sense of the instrument, again, that has been kind of demonstrated in Gavazza paper, but you see that it seems to be a correlation between high rainfall and low internet penetration, at least in 2010, which is the period of interest. And these are the coefficients. These are again the regression with a split sample on low vs high internet, right? And even though it's not super marked, it seems to be positive, right? So the places that got internet, that at least are more covered by internet, seems to have a higher correlation between candidate spending and the electoral results, right? This goes into the same direction as the results for radio, but you'll be, if you're attentive, you realize that indeed this goes into the other direction as the change over time that we observed in the main graph, which is so it means that this won't be an explanation for the drop in the early 2000s in the correlation between spending and votes. But nevertheless, I find it's interesting to see that indeed the introduction of technologies seems to improve this relationship. Okay, so because the findings in terms of technologies are not fully explanatory.
Edgar, may I interrupt for 1 second?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yes.
I just wanted to give you, say, a 2-minute warning so we can also move to the question and answer period.
Perfect. Let's be fine. I'm going to rush, but I'm near to the end. So here, what I'm going to show is that we actually can find explanation of the change in the relationship between spending and votes in changing electoral competition, in changing electoral environments in which those elections are taking place. One that is actually taken from a more theoretical literature is and also empirical, actually, is the idea of competition in the closeness of an election, right? Especially in the UK, that's an important dimension, right? Marginal seats and are not the same thing as safe seats, both in terms of the socio-demographic profile, but also the types of campaigning that happen in those places. And there's several papers that actually conjecture that relationship between campaign spending and votes should be higher in close election. And actually that's something that we see. So if we take election closeness as the margin between the first and the second candidate at the previous election, because the one of the election is obviously endogenous, and that we interact that with the impact of spending, we see that it's highly negative, right? So what it means is that the higher the margin, so the safest the election is, the safest the seat for the winner is, the less the spending of her or the other candidates is going to be important, or at least correlated with the votes, right? And I'm not going to go into details here because I don't have time. But what's interesting is that candidates may be internalizing this in the sense that if you compare safe and competitive seats, you see that there is a difference between candidates spend more in the competitive one, in the close one, right? But this doesn't seem to be driven by a notion of partisanship, right? In the sense that you could expect like more partisan districts are less likely to be influenced by campaign spending. But actually, if you look at this in the table, the interaction doesn't come out, right? So it doesn't seem to be driven by this. Sorry, that's the wrong slide. Okay, and to finish, another thing that actually matters and that I mentioned already are spending limits, right? This, as I mentioned, Fournet already showed that spending limits matter for the amount spent and the number of candidates, and it also matters for the correlation between spending and votes, right? And one important thing to notice here is that limits have changed over time, but not in very little in the recent years, right? So this correlation between spending limits and votes could maybe explain why the levels and the coefficients are very low in the beginning of the period, as you remember, but it doesn't explain the change in the recent years, apparently. Okay. That's it. That's, especially if it's over, that's all I wanted to say. So let me just wrap up with two two key elements that we can take from this presentation. The one is that there seems to be a large variation over time in the relationship between spending and votes. This probably should be a bit taken into account when thinking about both academically or politically about the topic. And interestingly, this could be driven by changes in information technologies. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that stimulating presentation. We do have a couple of questions percolating in. While we continue to gather questions, why don't I offer a couple of questions of my own just to start things off. Now, I don't expect you to offer answers to these questions right now, but let me just put them out there and then we'll see what's in the queue. So the first question I had was about the role of the two world wars. So they don't really seem to matter in your story, and that's fine. But I did find that somewhat surprising if we think about how important the world wars appear to have been for taxation, redistribution, public goods provision. I was sort of surprised that they didn't show up at all in altering the way that campaigns approach messaging and spending and that sort of thing. So that's the first question. The second question that came up for me was, how generalizable do you think these results are? So do you think that the sorts of patterns you're finding, really interesting patterns over the long run for the United Kingdom, do you think that we ought to find similar patterns if we look at other English-speaking countries, say the United States or Canada or Australia, or are these sort of specific to the United Kingdom? And then the third question was, I really like this long run perspective that you two are taking. And you kind of got at this both in the introduction and the conclusion, but I did want to hear a little more about how this long run perspective really alters or changes our understanding of the role of campaign spending. So those are just some comments to get us started, but actually we do have a couple questions. And so why don't I go to those if you don't mind?
Sure. I mean, yeah, I'm taking notes of all of them.
Okay, great. Sure. Okay, so one question here that just came up, we have 2 to 3 in the queue, is did the use of spending differ systematically by the party of the candidate? Were, say, conservative candidates or maybe labor candidates more likely to rely on spending to get votes? And that's a question by David Mitch.
Okay, so let me start with this one. So the answer is that actually it's the topic of a previous paper that we have, and what we find is indeed that the spending of parties doesn't seem to have the same impact. It's not exactly the same thing as the first part of the question, saying they don't seem to spend in very different categories, but indeed there's different levels of efficiency, or at least of sensitivity of spending and votes, depending on the party. And one actually interesting finding that we have in this paper is that if you take the UKIP, the extreme right in the UK, but also in France, because we're also using data in France, you see that over time, the efficiency of extreme right spending is increasing a lot, right? At the beginning, it's much higher. The beginning of the moment they appear, it's much higher than for other parties, and over time it's decreasing, but it's still much higher. And for the anecdote, the party for which the spending is actually the most efficient, or actually the most related with votes, is the Liberal Party, and that goes actually into some qualitative accounts of the fact that where the Liberals are running, they're usually quite well implemented, and the campaigning is actually quite efficient. So this is for the party. The question about the two world wars is very interesting. The thing is that what it mattered for is actually to generate reforms. So you have a big reform in 1918, which is both an extension of the franchise, that many historians have correlated to the fact that indeed we were basically sending the working class to the war, and when they came back, they kind of asked for more political representation. But at least the point is that there has been this big reform, and this reform as well decreased a lot the spending limits. So these are the two impacts that the First World War had, and a similar thing happened after the Second World War, when in 1948 you also have a huge decrease in the spending limits. But that's it, and you're right that it's interesting that at least in terms of the relationship between spending and votes, especially pre-Second World War and post-Second World War, there doesn't seem to be a large impact, right? And maybe it's also because over the war, there hasn't been such significant changes in the way campaigns are led, and especially the technologies that the campaigns are using. Right? These changes happened, for instance, much later on, as we kind of looked at. And for your other questions, Mark, in terms of how generalizable and what's the interest of a long-run approach, well, what I would say is that obviously this exact pattern is not generalizable. That could be something that's topical to the UK. But what we kind of want to bring the attention to by showing this, and this is also why we think the long run is important, is that there seems to be variation, and this variation over time and space is large, right? Is significant, right? So every time actually any study wants to generalize a finding about the impact of campaigning in general, and especially campaign spending, one has to think, well, in what space and time is it taking place, right? And I think that echoes also the fact that nowadays we can trying to think that social media is changing drastically the impact of campaigning, and this is why again a lot of studies are looking at this.
Okay, thank you. So let me go to a couple more questions. Let me combine a couple of questions. So the first is by Chris Colvin, and he says, how about spillover effects from nearby radio, say someone listening to Radio Norwich from Fockenham? And then I guess you might say somewhat related question is by Gabriel Mezavaje, and I hope I'm pronouncing that okay, who says, following up on Chris's question, the maps are great, but show strong spatial correlation. How have you guys thought about or dealt with the spatial problem?
These are good points. The first thing I would say is that the map is a little bit misleading in the sense that this colors constituencies fully, where some of them are actually just partly covered, right? Because if you have the center of a radio here, it's going to be located around here, right? So this is something that we code. We know whether the constituency is just partially or fully covered, right? But the point here is that first, it limits a little bit the contact between the two set of constituencies in the two different regions. But it's totally right that there could be some spillover effects, right? It could be that indeed some people at the border here could already have information through the radio, thanks to the fact that they live nearby this area. The point here is that actually this information shouldn't impact them, because if under the logic that the radio here is covering this region, they should cover actually the local elections of this region, right? And so if you live in another constituency, if the radio is actually not at least mainly in your constituency, you may expect to have less information about your own candidate, and so it shouldn't change much the relationship between the action of these candidates and votes, right? And then there's the question of, indeed, there seems to be spatial correlation, though I think it's kind of fairly distributed across the whole territory. But indeed, it's kind of centered a lot in the Midlands and in the South. The idea here is that we also extend the period. So here I'm showing you just the 1 year before and 1 year after the freeze. But what we do is that we vary this window so that we can actually get constituencies that are spread in other places and that are more dispersed. And indeed, we see that the results are roughly the same. So I believe it kind of alleviates a bit the fact that it could be spatially correlated. But it's a very good comment.
So let me switch to a question from Eric Monet. Hi, Eric. And he asks, could you compute the minimum spending to be elected scaled by average income or wealth in the population and see how it evolved over time?
Yes, I mean it's a very valid point. So indeed, what we haven't done, so we see how they spend on average. You're totally right that it's. I mean, I guess it's something you have in mind. This spending is driven by both candidates that are going to be elected and candidates that are not, and this is especially true in the recent years, right? If you have, this is also something I hadn't time to discuss, but the number of candidates is increasing a lot over time, and especially in recent years. And all the new candidates in recent years are usually candidates that are much less likely to win. It's the small parties that are just participating to the election for probably other reasons than the hope of being elected. And these candidates spend less and are driving the amounts, the mean amounts quite a lot. So this is something we can do. We haven't, but kind of calculate only for the candidates that succeeded, or at least to find some way to say, well, what's the amount, the decent amount of money that you need the amount that you need to put to have a decent chance to be elected. That's a very good comment. Thanks.
Okay, so there's two more questions I'd like to ask here before we wrap up and go to the more informal part. So one comes from Rui Estevez, and he says, with regards to electoral competition, why don't you control for pre-election measures of how safe seats were rather than ex post differences in voting outcomes, as these can be endogenous?
Okay, so sorry if I wasn't clear. We are using previous year margins. So these are not exposed outcomes in terms of electoral competition. That being said, you're right that the best measure would be some poll or some appreciation of the closeness of the district at the beginning of the current election, right? But this is something that, at least to my knowledge, is not possible to get for the whole time period and sufficiently systematically for all elections. But sorry if I wasn't clear. We're using the margins at the previous election so that we kind of alleviate a bit the endogeneity of the competitivity of a district.
Okay, and then one final question here before we move to the informal parts. And this is another question from Gabriel. And he says, do you think the changing role of political parties mattered here? For instance, in the 19th century, parties were much less organized, whereas now they take a more organized national strategy.
Yes, actually, it's a very good point, and that's something we're currently digging into. That's why I didn't spend too much on this, but there's two answers to this. The first answer is that those parties, indeed, the national parties, change a lot over time. They took a much major role after the Second World War. That's something we document indeed at the aggregate level by taking the accounts of the annual accounts of the party and looking at the total spending at the country level, right? This is only possible for Conservative and Labour because these are the only ones who have like systematic annual accounts. And we see that over the second half of the 20th century, the amount they spend in campaigns increases a lot. But technically, what they spend at the national level shouldn't interfere at the local level. Otherwise, these are expenses that are requalified, right? So this is important to note, is that in theory, national campaigning is at another level than local campaigning. And for instance, national parties cannot directly mention candidates in some campaign messengers, etc. So otherwise, this is going to be counted as a spending of the candidate. That being said, and this is the second part of the answer, it's totally true that not only the national campaign parties campaign at the national level, they also change the way they provide support to local constituencies, to local parties. One way is to professionalize them, in a sense, is to send volunteers or send organizers. So this probably changed the relationship between spending and votes. So this is actually something that could have explained or or pattern, and that is why we're digging into it. And so yeah, so it's a totally good point, and the national parties could play a big role.
Okay, fantastic. Well, let's thank our presenters for again, showing us this very stimulating new work. Next week, we're going to have a presentation on why is Europe less equal than the United States by Thomas Blanchet, Amory Gathine, and Lucas Chancel. And that'll mark sort of the end of our formal seminar today. Thanks to all of you who participated. And what we'll do now is for those of you who'd like to stay and have some further questions to ask, we'll spend about 15 minutes. Okay, so moving into that informal part, we do have a question here to start us off. And actually, this is something that I was wondering about as well. And so the question comes from Rui Estevez again. And what he says is, can you please say more about the use of rainfall as the IV? To me, meaning to Rui, it looked like a dummy for the Southwest, where population's more spread out and hence internet is more expensive to roll out, a problem that continues to this day.
Okay, it's a good point. Two things to say. The first one is that this is a map of the average rainfall, and what we're using is multiple variables, right? We also using the maximum rainfall that you can get on one day, like the intensity of the rain. We also having different time periods for the rainfall, especially longer time periods, right? That being said, so this varies a bit, this distribution. That being said, it's totally true that it's very geographically located because it's by definition a geographic phenomenon, right? So the point here is that what we don't want this is a valid comment to make to Gavazza and Carter's listed paper. The point that's important for us is that we want to control whether the introduction of the introduction of internet is not related to some things that are also impacting the change over time in the efficiency of spending, right? Because what we're looking at here is a delta between 2005 and 2010. And in that case, I'm not sure if those regions, if indeed it's a bit like a dummy for the west of the UK, would have specific dimensions related to spending that we need to know, at least at this period in time, that would impact our estimates. But it's a valid point that it's indeed very, very geographically located, that we have to keep that in mind.
Edgar, if I can just interrupt, given that we just moved to the more informal part, on this thing, these are the broad map from Gavazza, but what they then show is that even within district, you have a lot of variations, and that in fact all their effect is driven by super local variations within district. So it works overall, but in fact it's not driven by west versus south or whatever. It's driven by differences that are much more local at the end of the day, which is why their IV is strong in their paper, and we think that it can be a strong IV for us too.
If I may,
please.
I mean myself. I know that the IV works, right? But I wonder if a stronger IV wouldn't be the dispersion of population, because that's really what's keeping the rollout of broadband in the UK. It's not how much it rains. It's, if you need to connect a cottage and the next one will be at 5 miles away, no internet company has an interest to do it.
Yeah, it's a good point. I don't know what you think, Julia, but indeed it seems like a very valid idea for an instrument.
Well, I do think you might want to think about whether that would satisfy the exclusion restriction, because population density may well be related to the amount of campaign spending you need to spend, particularly when technology is rather limited. Maybe Today it's less important. But let me just say one thing here, sort of as an announcement. Marvin asked a question about whether a recording will be available afterwards. And the answer is yes, all of these seminars are recorded and they're posted to YouTube, and you can find the relevant information on the CEPR webpage. But yes, it is being recorded and will be posted publicly. So Rui had he had 3 questions, and so perhaps we should move to his 3rd question, which is, can you distinguish between general party spending and locally targeted spending? Arguably, the latter should matter more for local political competition than the former.
Okay, so what you mean by that is that national spending by the parties, the national parties, and local spending by the national party. Is that correct?
Rui, would you like to clarify?
Absolutely. Well, what I meant is that you can spend money on, say, vote labor, and you have a general message, vote labor for the whole country. Then you can spend on vote on this particular MP, or organize, a get-together, a meeting for this particular MP, right? The UK system is known for being first past the poll system that is very localized. I was just wondering if you could get more identification, more heterogeneity, but distinguished.
Well, it's indeed that's what I mentioned earlier. I think it's technically national parties, are not allowed to do a campaigning directly on local MPs. Otherwise, this would enter into the spending limits and accounts of the local MP in question, right? So technically, at least in terms of direct campaigning, there shouldn't be not too much overlap between the national party and the local party. But you're totally right in saying that local spending is what matters. At least that's what we're trying to push here, right? Is that here the information that we have is really the spending of a specific candidate from a specific party into his or her constituency, and that we see that indeed this seems to matter. Even though there are national parties that at the national level say vote Labour, how much compared to other candidates and other candidates from your own party, because we have party fixed effects, as an individual Labour candidate into a specific constituency, how much you spend is impacting your electoral results.
Okay, so there's 2 more questions, at least, that I think we ought to get to. The first one was asked a while back by George Perendia, and it's about the role of social media spending. And let me just sort of try and embellish a bit on that question. So if I understood correctly, you look at internet spending, but of course, within the internet, there's all different ways of spending money, right? There's Facebook, there's, well, I don't know, Twitter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So can you sort of break down this black box of the internet and try and figure out what's going on there?
Well, we would love to. Unfortunately, I think it's difficult with the data that we have. And I'm not even sure is actually would be part of this paper, which is really looking again. I mean, we could do that for the internet. We could do that for TV. I think it's actually super interesting. It probably even more interesting. In papers that are looking at the specific impact of Facebook campaigning or email on the internet, campaigning through emails, or other techniques, like not internet related, are asking this question super well. With the data that we have, we can't, because actually the only information that we have in terms of categories is whether they spend in advertising or in meetings, or again, you've seen the categories, right? And in this disaggregation, we're not able to see, well, in terms of internet, candidates are spending on this specific feature of the internet, and so this is the feature that seems to matter. But yeah, sorry.
No. If I can just ask a follow-up to that, which is, and pardon me if I missed this during your presentation, which is the role of free free media, free advertising. And so in the United States in 2016, one of the major presidential candidates received an estimated $2 billion, I believe, in free media sort of publicity. And so that may have reduced the amount that that campaign actually needed to spend. So I'm just wondering if, you know, that sounds maybe like a omitted variable that you might want to consider, or how do you account for that?
Well, it's I think in our case, this could happen. It could happen through the local media, right? Because again, we're looking at something that's very local, and at the national level, there's no presidential debate or at least interview on national TV that allows to for one candidate to gain a lot from that. But it's totally true that this could happen for some candidates. There's two things. First, in our specification, we have a lot of we have party fixed effects, we have time fixed effects. We control, especially for candidates, fixed effects. So we're gonna have within a candidate is change over time, given a special exposure of a candidate for other reasons, over time the change in their in the spending, how is it going to affect the votes? So we're controlling a bit for that with the specification per se, but then this is also one factor that could explain the impact of technologies, right? Because as I mentioned, for instance, local radio, you cannot do direct paid advertisement on radio as a candidate. But what happens is that if you do a meeting, if you do this or that, then the local radio is going to report about this. And this means that you're probably going to get more visibility, right? And so at least this is one of the mechanisms that we have in mind, which is this free, in a sense, this free advertising. But this free advertising could also magnify, the impact of spending. At least this is probably what we would see here, in a sense that one event that you're going to organize with €1 could be actually much more impactful if all the local radios are reporting about this, and this, as you say, it's free advertising.
Okay, and so why don't we wrap up here, since we're nearing in on 12:15 my time, I guess 6:15 p.m. your time, by David Mitch. And so this is a question that has to do again with sort of population density, I guess. And what he asks is, I'd expect that perhaps campaign spending might have more impact in large urban areas than for more rural communities for which personal networks would be better established and less immune to spending impacts. Is this considered in your analysis?
So it's I would have expect the same, and actually it doesn't seem to be the case. How do we know that? In the UK, there is a distinction between borough constituencies and county constituencies. It's a historical distinction. The first purpose of it is to set different types of spending limits, in a sense that a borough would be an urban constituency and would actually need less money to reach the voters. So historically, there's difference between the two. This difference nowadays is very small. But what we tested is whether between county and boroughs, there seems to be differential impacts of spending, and at least on average over time, it doesn't seem to be the case. But you're right that it's probably something that we want to dig a bit further, because it's a totally as I said, it's totally intuitive and valid explanation.
Okay, and on that note, I think that's a wrap. Thank you again for taking the time to share your work with us. Greatly appreciated. And thanks to all the participants who stayed for after hours, as it were. I'm going to end things here. I hope everyone has a good evening or a good day, depending what time it is where you live. And we'll see you next week.
Thanks so much for the comments. Thanks for the organization. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.